The waitress warned the billionaire. "Don't sign that." His next move stunned the whole room. The rooftop restaurant glittered like a palace that night. Chandeliers burned bright, the skyline stretched like a sea of diamonds, and every guest knew they were witnessing history. At the center table sat billionaire Richard Callahan, a man whose pen carried the weight of empires. In front of him, a contract worth billions. His fingers curled around a golden pen, seconds away from sealing the deal of his life. The investors leaned forward, hungry smiles flashing like knives. But then, silence. A waitress, almost invisible until now, froze mid-step. Her instincts screamed. She leaned closer, voice trembling but fierce. "Don't sign that." And in that instant, the entire room stopped breathing. Richard Callahan was more than a billionaire. To the world, he was a legend, a man who had clawed his way from nothing to everything. Every headline painted him as untouchable, unstoppable, the kind of man who could bend the world to his will. But that night, even he didn't realize how close he was to losing it all. The investors at his table looked perfect. Tailored suits, polished smiles, voices dipped in charm. They had flown in on private jets, promising Richard the world. Global expansion, markets he'd never dreamed of, profits that would echo for generations. The contract before him glistened like a treasure chest, every page dripping with opportunity. The rooftop restaurant seemed made for such moments. Candlelight shimmered against crystal glasses. Violins whispered in the background, and the city stretched endlessly beneath them. To outsiders, it looked like triumph unfolding. But Maya saw something else. She wasn't supposed to notice. She was just a waitress. 23. Tired, juggling plates and overdue rent. Yet, life had trained her to read people in ways the wealthy never imagined. She noticed the cracks in their smiles, the flickers in their eyes, the nervous tap of one man's fingers against his glass. She noticed how another investor avoided looking at Richard at all, burying himself in wine as though hiding guilt. And then she noticed the contract. One glance at the bold letters half hidden under. Richard's hand made her blood run cold. Transfer of majority ownership. Her gut twisted. This wasn't a partnership. It was an ambush. Maya tried to walk away. She told herself it wasn't her business. She was a waitress, invisible to men like Richard Callahan. What right did she have to interfere? But every time she passed that table, her unease sharpened like a knife. The air around the investors was too heavy, their eagerness too desperate. One man's smirk betrayed him completely. The kind of smirk that said we've already won. Meanwhile, Richard was relaxed, amused even. He had played this game 1,000 times. Men flattering him, begging for his signature. He prided himself on seeing through lies. Tonight, he believed he was in control. Maya's hands trembled as she set down another round of wine. Her eyes flicked to the contract again. Fine print coiled across the page like a snake. Words like restructuring and controlling interest screamed louder with each glance. If he signed, he wouldn't just lose money. He would lose everything. Her heart pounded. She thought of her mother working 2 jobs, of her younger brother asking if life ever got easier. She thought of all the times she had stayed quiet when something felt wrong, too afraid, too powerless to speak. Not this time. Richard lifted the pen. The nib caught the chandelier's glow, sparkling like destiny. The investors leaned in, eyes gleaming. The room's energy shifted, anticipation thick as thunderclouds before a storm. Maya's chest burned. Every instinct screamed. The words ripped out of her before she could stop them. "Don't sign that." The restaurant froze. Forks clattered onto plates. Conversations choked into silence. Every head turned toward the young waitress who had just interrupted a billionaire. The investors' smiles cracked, eyes flashing with fury. Richard's hand stilled, pen hovering. Slowly, he raised his gaze to hers. She looked terrified, trembling, but there was steel in her eyes. Time stretched thin, like glass about to shatter. One investor scoffed, his voice cutting through the silence. "This is absurd. She's just a waitress. She doesn't know what she's talking about." But Richard didn't move. His instincts, the instincts that had built his empire, whispered something was off. He studied Maya, searching her face. She wasn't bluffing. She wasn't grandstanding. She was begging him to see what she had seen. "Why?" Richard asked, his voice low, dangerous. Maya's throat was dry, but she forced the words out. "Because that contract, it doesn't make you richer. It takes everything. Look at the fine print." The investors shifted uncomfortably. One reached for the contract, but Richard's hand was faster. He dragged it back toward him, eyes narrowing. For the first time, he really read it. Not the bold promises, but the buried poison. And there it was. Transfer of majority ownership, restructuring of leadership, controlling interest. The blood drained from his face, his empire, his life's work, slipping into the hands of men who had played him like a fool. Richard's jaw clenched. The pen clicked softly as he set it down. You almost had me, he said, voice sharp as a blade. The investors' masks shattered. Panic replaced charm. One sputtered excuses, another demanded he ignore the nonsense. But Richard was no longer listening. He had seen the truth. Security moved in, called by a simple nod from Richard. The investors scrambled, their protests echoing through the hushed restaurant. The guests watched in stunned silence as the wolves were dragged out, their empire-crushing scheme destroyed in an instant. And at the center of it all, Richard turned to Maya, the waitress who had stopped it all with 4 trembling words. For a long moment, Richard said nothing. He simply stared at her as though seeing her for the first time. This wasn't just luck. This was courage. Thank you, he said finally, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. Maya swallowed hard. I couldn't let you sign it. Richard's lips curved into the faintest smile. Sometimes, he said, the loudest truth comes from the quietest voices. By morning, the story spread across headlines. Billionaire saved by waitress's warning. Some called it fate, others instinct. But many saw something deeper, the reminder that wisdom, courage, and truth don't belong only to the powerful. Richard never forgot that night. Quietly, he ensured Maya's family would never struggle again, covering debts, securing opportunities. But more than that, he carried with him the humbling truth. Even the richest man in the room can be blind, and sometimes the smallest voice can be the one that saves everything.